The Man with the Roller by E.G. Swain and read by Christopher Halton. Good evening and welcome once again to Haunted Tales of Darkness. Tonight we journey into the quiet English countryside for one of the finest and most unjustly neglected ghost stories of the early 20th century. The Man with the Roller by E.G. Swain. First published in 1912 as the opening story in Swain's only supernatural collection, the Stoneground Ghost Tales. This tale introduced readers to the fictional parish of Stoneground and its amiable clergyman, the Reverend Roland Batchel. Swain possessed an intimate knowledge of the English village church and its traditions, lending his stories an authenticity that few writers have equalled. Edmund Gill Swain was himself an Anglican clergyman and a close contemporary of M.R. James. The two men shared a friendship forged through their time at King's College, Cambridge, where Swain served as a fellow and later vice-master. James greatly admired his friend's writing, and Swain in turn dedicated the Stoneground Ghost Tales to him. Although James casts a long shadow over these stories, Swain never merely imitates him. Instead, he brings a warmth, gentle humour and pastoral charm all of his own, creating tales that are quieter perhaps, but no less capable of sending a shiver down the spine. As always, settle back, dim the lights if you dare, and where in the dead of night the steady sound of a roller approaches. On the edge of that vast tract of East Anglia, which retains its ancient name of the Fens, there may be found, by those who know where to seek it, a certain village called Stoneground. It was once a picturesque village. Today it is not to be called either a village or picturesque. Man dwells not in one house of clay, but in two, and the material of the second is drawn from the earth upon which this and the neighbouring villages stood. The unlovely signs of the industry have changed the place alike in aspect and in population. Many who have seen the fossil skeletons of great saurians brought out of the clay in which they have lain from prehistoric times have thought that the inhabitants of the place have not since changed for the better. The chief habitations, however, have their foundations not upon clay, but upon a bed of gravel which anciently gave to the place its name, and upon the highest part of this gravel stands, and has stood for many centuries, the parish church, dominating the landscape for miles around. Stoneground, however, is no longer the inaccessible village which in the Middle Ages stood out above a waste of waters. Occasional floods served to indicate what was once its ordinary outlook, but in more recent times the construction of roads and railways and the drainage of the fens have given it freedom of communication with the world from which it was formerly isolated. The vicarage of Stoneground stands hard by the church, and is renowned for its spacious garden, part of which, and that, as might be expected, the part nearest the house is of ancient date. To the original plot, successive vicars have added adjacent land, so that the garden has gradually acquired the state in which it now appears. The vicars have been many in number. Since Henry de Greville was instituted in the year 1140, there have been 30, all of whom have lived and most of whom have died, in successive vicarage houses upon the present site. The present incumbent, Mr. Batchel, is a solitary man of somewhat studious habits, but is not too much enamoured of his solitude to receive visits from time to time from schoolboys and such. In the summer of the year 1906 he entertained two who are the occasion of this narrative, though still unconscious of their part in it, for one of the two, celebrating his 15th birthday during his visit to Stoneground, was presented by Mr. Batchel with a new camera with which he proceeded to photograph with considerable skill the surroundings of the house. One of these photographs Mr. Batchel thought particularly pleasing. It was a view of the house with the lawn in the foreground. A few small copies, such as the boy's camera was capable of producing, were sent to him by his young friend some weeks after the visit, And again Mr. Batchel was so much pleased with the picture that he begged for the negative with the intention of having the view enlarged. The boy met the request with what seemed a needlessly modest plea. There were 2 negatives, he replied, but each of them had, in the same part of the picture, a small blur for which there was no accounting otherwise than by carelessness. His desire, therefore, was to discard these films and to produce something more worthy of enlargement upon a subsequent visit. Mr. Batchel, however, persisted in his request, and upon receipt of the negative examined it with a lens. He was just able to detect the blur alluded to. An examination under a powerful glass in fact revealed something more than he had at first detected. The blur was like the nucleus of a comet, as one sees it represented in pictures, and seemed to be connected with a faint streak which extended across the negative. It was, however, so inconsiderable a defect that Mr. Batchel resolved to disregard it. He had a neighbour whose favourite pastime was photography, one who was notably skilled in everything that pertained to the art, and to him he sent the negative, with the request for an enlargement, reminding him of a long-standing promise to do any such service when, as had now happened, his friend might see fit to ask it. This neighbour who had acquired such skill in photography was one Mr. Groves, a young clergyman residing in the precincts of the Minster near at hand, which was visible from Mr. Batchel's garden. He lodged with a Mrs. Rumney, a superannuated servant of the palace, and a strong-minded, vigorous woman still, exactly such a one as Mr. Groves needed to have about him, for he was a constant trial to Mrs. Rumney, and but for the wholesome fear she begot in him, would have converted his rooms into a mere den. Her carpets and tablecloths were continually bespattered with chemicals. Her chimney-piece ornaments had been unceremoniously stowed away and replaced by labelled bottles. Even the bed of Mr. Groves was by day strewn with drying films and mounts, and her old and favourite cat had a bald patch on his flank, the result of a mishap with the pyrogallic acid. Mrs. Rumney's lodger, however, was a great favourite with her, as such helpless men are apt to be with motherly women, and she took no small pride in his work. A life-size portrait of herself, originally a peace offering, hung in her parlour, and had long excited the envy of every friend who took tea with her. "Mr. Groves," she was wont to say, "is a nice gentleman, and chemical though he may be, I'd rather wait on him for nothing than what I would on anyone else for twice the money." Every new piece of photographic work was of interest to Mrs. Rumney, and she expected to be allowed both to admire and to criticise. The view of Stoneground Vicarage, therefore, was shown to her upon its arrival. "Well may it want enlarging," she remarked, "and it no bigger than a postage stamp. It looks more like a doll's house than a vicarage." And with this she went about her work, whilst Mr. Groves retired to his dark room with the film, to see what he could make of the task assigned to him. 2 days later, after repeated visits to his dark room, he had made something considerable, and when Mrs. Rumney brought him his chop for luncheon, she was lost in admiration. A large but unfinished print stood upon his easel, and such a picture of Stoneground Vicarage was in the making as was calculated to delight both the young photographer and the vicar. Mr. Groves spent only his mornings, as a rule, in photography. His afternoons he gave to pastoral work, and the work upon this enlargement was over for the day. It required little more than touching up, but it was this touching up which made the difference between the enlargements of Mr. Groves and those of other men. The print, therefore, was to be left upon the easel until the morrow, when it was to be finished. Mrs. Rumney and he together gave it an admiring inspection as she was carrying away the tray, and what they agreed in admiring most particularly was the smooth and open stretch of lawn, which made so excellent a foreground for the picture. "It looks," said Mrs. Rumney, who had once been young, "as if it was waiting for someone to come and dance on it." Mr. Groves left his lodgings, we must now be particular about the hours, at 2:30 with the intention of returning, as usual, at 5. "As regular as a clock," Mrs. Rumney was wont to say, "and a sight more regular than some clocks I knows of." Upon this day he was nevertheless somewhat late. Some visit had detained him unexpectedly, and it was 5:15 when he inserted his latchkey in Mrs. Rumney's door. Hardly had he entered when his landlady, obviously awaiting him, appeared in the passage. Her face, usually florid, was of the colour of parchment, and breathing hurriedly and shortly, she pointed at the door of Mr. Groves's room. In some alarm at her condition, Mr. Groves hastily questioned her. All she could say was, "The photograph! The photograph!" Mr. Groves could only suppose that his enlargement had met with some mishap for which Mrs. Rumney was responsible. Perhaps she had allowed it to flutter into the fire. He turned towards his room in order to discover the worst, but at this Mrs. Rumney laid a trembling hand upon his arm and held him back. "Don't go in," she said. "Have your tea in the parlour." "Nonsense," said Mr. Groves. "If that is gone, we can easily do another." "Gone," said his landlady. "I wish to heaven it was." The ensuing conversation shall not detain us. It will suffice to say that after a considerable time Mr. Groves succeeded in quieting his landlady, so much so that she consented, still trembling violently, to enter the room with him. To speak truth, she was as much concerned for him as for herself, and she was not by nature a timid woman. The room, so far from disclosing to Mr. Groves any cause for excitement, appeared wholly unchanged. In its usual place stood every article of his stained and ill-used furniture. On the easel stood the photograph, precisely where he had left it, and except that his tea was not upon the table, everything was in its usual state and place. But Mrs. Rumney again became excited and tremulous. "It's there!" she cried. "Look at the lawn!" Mr. Groves stepped quickly forward and looked at the photograph. Then he turned as pale as Mrs. Rumney herself. There was a man with an indescribably horrible suffering face, rolling the lawn with a large roller. Mr. Groves retreated in amazement to where Mrs. Rumney had remained standing. "Has anyone been in here?" he asked. "Not a soul," was the reply. "I came in to make up the fire, and turned to have another look at the picture, when I saw that dead-alive face at the edge. It gave me the creeps," she said, "particularly from not having noticed it before. If that's anyone in Stoneground, I said to myself, I wonder the vicar has him in the garden with that awful face. It took that hold of me. I thought I must come and look at it again, and at 5 o'clock I brought your tea in. And then I saw him moved along right in front, with a roller dragging behind him like you see." Mr. Groves was greatly puzzled. Mrs. Rumney's story, of course, was incredible, but this strange evil-faced man had appeared in the photograph somehow. That he had not been there when the print was made was quite certain. The problem soon ceased to alarm Mr. Groves. In his mind it was investing itself with a scientific interest. He began to think of suspended chemical action, and other possible avenues of investigation. At Mrs. Rumney's urgent entreaty, however, he turned the photograph upon the easel, and with only its white back presented to the room, he sat down and ordered tea to be brought in. He did not look again at the picture. The face of the man had about it something unnaturally painful. He could remember and still see, as it were, the drawn features, and the look of the man had unaccountably distressed him. He finished his slight meal, and having lit a pipe, began to brood over the scientific possibilities of the problem. Had any other photograph upon the original film become involved in the one he had enlarged? Had the image of any other face, distorted by the enlarging lens, become a part of this picture? For the space of 2 hours he debated this possibility and that, only to reject them all. His optical knowledge told him that no conceivable accident could have brought into his picture a man with a roller. No negative of his had ever contained such a man. If it had, no natural causes would suffice to leave him, as it were, hovering about the apparatus. His repugnance to the actual thing had by this time lost its freshness, and he determined to end his scientific musings with another inspection of the object. So he approached the easel and turned the photograph round again. His horror returned, and with good cause. The man with the roller had now advanced to the middle of the lawn. The face was stricken still with the same indescribable look of suffering. The man seemed to be appealing to the spectator for some kind of help. Almost he spoke. Mr. Groves was naturally reduced to a condition of extreme nervous excitement. Although not by nature what is called a nervous man, he trembled from head to foot. With a sudden effort he turned away his head, took hold of the picture with his outstretched hand, and opening a drawer in his sideboard, thrust the thing underneath a folded tablecloth which was lying there. Then he closed the drawer and took up an entertaining book to distract his thoughts from the whole matter. In this he succeeded very ill, yet somehow the rest of the evening passed, and as it wore away he lost something of his alarm. At 10 o'clock Mrs. Rumney, knocking and receiving answer twice, lest by any chance she should find herself alone in the room, brought in the cocoa, usually taken by her lodger at that hour. A hasty glance at the easel showed her that it stood empty, and her face betrayed her relief. She made no comment, and Mr. Groves invited none. The latter, however, could not make up his mind to go to bed. The face he had seen was taking firm hold upon his imagination, and seemed to fascinate him and repel him at the same time. Before long he found himself wholly unable to resist the impulse to look at it once more. He took it again with some indecision from the drawer and laid it under the lamp. The man with the roller had now passed completely over the lawn and was near the left of the picture. The shock to Mr. Groves was again considerable. He stood facing the fire, trembling with excitement which refused to be suppressed. In this state his eye lighted upon the calendar hanging before him, and it furnished him with some distraction. The next day was his mother's birthday. Never did he omit to write a letter which should lie upon her breakfast table, and the preoccupation of this evening had made him wholly forgetful of the matter. There was a collection of letters, however, from the pillar box near at hand, at 1:15 midnight, so he turned to his desk, wrote a letter which would at least serve to convey his affectionate greetings, and having written it, went out into the night and posted it. The clocks were striking midnight as he returned to his room. We may be sure that he did not resist the desire to glance at the photograph he had left on his table, but the results of that glance he, at any rate, had not anticipated. The man with the roller had disappeared. The lawn lay as smooth and clear as at first, looking, as Mrs. Rumney had said, as if it was waiting for someone to come and dance on it. The photograph, after this, remained a photograph and nothing more. Mr. Groves would have liked to persuade himself that it had never undergone these changes which he had witnessed, and which we have endeavoured to describe, but his sense of their reality was too insistent. He kept the print lying for a week upon his easel. Mrs. Rumney, although she had ceased to dread it, was obviously relieved at its disappearance when it was carried to Stoneground to be delivered to Mr. Batchel. Mr. Groves said nothing of the man with the roller, but gave the enlargement without comment into his friend's hands. The work of enlargement had been skilfully done, and was deservedly praised. Mr. Groves, making some modest disclaimer, observed that the view, with its spacious foreground of lawn, was such as could not have failed to enlarge well. And this lawn, he added, as they sat looking out of the vicar's study, looks as well from within your house as from without. It must give you a sense of responsibility, he added reflectively, to be sitting where your predecessors have sat for so many centuries, and to be continuing their peaceful work. The mere presence before your window of the turf upon which good men have walked is an inspiration. The vicar made no reply to these somewhat sententious remarks. For a moment he seemed as if he would speak some words of conventional assent. Then he abruptly left the room to return in a few minutes with a parchment book. "Your remark, Groves," he said as he seated himself again, "recalled to me a curious bit of history. I went up to the old library to get the book. This is the journal of William Long, who was vicar here, up to the year 1602. What you said about the lawn will give you an interest in a certain portion of the journal. I will read it. August 1st, 1600. I am now returned in haste from a journey to Brighthelmstone, whither I had gone with full intention to remain about the space of 2 months. Master Josiah Wilburton, of my dear College of Emmanuel, having consented to assume the charge of my parish of Stoneground in the meantime. But I had intelligence, after 12 days' absence, by a messenger from the churchwardens, that Master Wilburton had disappeared last Monday se'nnight, and had been no more seen. So here I am again in my study, to the entire frustration of my plans, and can do nothing in my perplexity but sit and look out from my window, before which Andrew Birch rolleth the grass with much persistence. Andrew passeth so many times over the same place with his roller, that I have just now stepped without to demand why he so wasteth his labour. And upon this he hath pointed out a place which is not levelled, and hath continued his rolling. August 2nd. There is a change in Andrew Birch since my absence, who hath indeed the aspect of one in great depression, which is noteworthy of so cheerful a man. He haply shares our common trouble in respect of Master Wilburton, of whom we remain without tidings. Having made part of a sermon upon the 7th chapter of the former epistle of St. Paul to the Corinthians, and the 27th verse, I found Andrew again at his task, and bade him desist and saddle my horse, being minded to ride forth and take counsel with my good friend John Palmer at the deanery, who bore Master Wilburton great affection. August 2nd continued. Dire news awaiteth me upon my return. The sheriff's men have disinterred the body of poor Master W. from beneath the grass Andrew was rolling, and have arrested him on the charge of being his cause of death. August 10th. Alas, Andrew Birch hath been hanged, the justice having mercifully ordered that he should hang by the neck until he should be dead, and not sooner molested. May the Lord have mercy on his soul. He made full confession before me that he had slain Master Wilburton in heat, upon his threatening to make me privy to certain peculation, of which I should not have suspected so old a servant. The poor man bemoaned his evil temper in great contrition, and beat his breast, saying that he knew himself doomed for ever to roll the grass in the place where he had tried to conceal his wicked fact. Thank you, said Mr. Grove. Has that little negative got the date upon it? Yes, replied Mr. Batchel, as he examined it with his glass. The boy has marked it August 10th. The vicar seemed not to remark the coincidence with the date of Birch's execution. Needless to say that it did not escape Mr. Groves, but he kept silence about the man with the roller, who has been no more seen to this day. Doubtless there is more in our photography than we yet know of. The camera sees more than the eye, and chemicals in a freshly prepared and active state have a power which they afterwards lose. Our units of time, adopted for the convenience of persons dealing with the ordinary movements of material objects, are of course conventional. Those who turn the instruments of science upon nature will always be in danger of seeing more than they looked for. There is such a disaster as that of knowing too much, and at some time or another it may overtake each of us. May we then be as wise as Mr. Groves in our reticence, if our turn should come. The end. Thank you for listening. The Man with the Roller remains one of E.G. Swain's most celebrated tales, and it is easy to understand why. It perfectly captures that peculiarly English form of supernatural fiction, in which the familiar landscape is transformed by the quiet intrusion of something that simply should not be there. Readers familiar with M.R. James will undoubtedly notice echoes of his influence. Like many of James's close friends and literary associates, Swain occasionally drew inspiration from ideas his friend had already explored. In this instance, one can detect a kinship with James's celebrated story, The Mezzotint. Yet Swain does not reproduce James's tale. Rather, he takes a similar underlying concept, that of a supernatural manifestation, repeating its dreadful purpose, and reshapes it into something entirely his own. Gone are the haunted engraving and academic setting, replaced instead by an image whose quiet persistence becomes increasingly unsettling. That perhaps is Swain's greatest strength. He reminds us that horror need not shout to be effective. Sometimes the most disturbing things are those that arrive slowly, night after night, with no explanation, and no apparent end. If you enjoyed this forgotten classic, do consider subscribing, as there are many more overlooked masterpieces waiting to be rediscovered. Until next time, thank you for listening, and good night. For several years, I've devoted myself to creating original ghost stories, strange tales, atmospheric narrations, and supernatural fiction through haunted tales of darkness. What many people perhaps do not realize is the amount of work involved behind the scenes: the writing, editing, research, recording, artwork, publishing, and production that goes into trying to create something worthy of the great tradition of classic supernatural storytelling. I continue to do it because I genuinely love the work. Some months ago, however, YouTube effectively removed my ability to earn revenue from the channel, claiming that my content was somehow inauthentic. I was far from alone in this, as many other readers, writers, and narration channels were similarly affected. Ironically, this has happened at a time when the platform itself is increasingly flooded with AI-generated material. Part of the issue, I suspect, is that YouTube strongly favors midstream advertising, which is completely at odds with the kind of immersive storytelling experience I try to create. Interrupting a ghost story midway through with loud advertising breaks the atmosphere and destroys the flow for both reader and listener alike. A number of people have asked whether there is another way to support the channel and my writing directly, and that would be by supporting me through Patreon for anyone who wishes to help support future stories, books, narrations, and projects. There is absolutely no obligation, of course. Watching, listening, commenting, and sharing the work already helps enormously. But for those who would like to contribute monthly or simply leave the occasional gift of support, it would be deeply appreciated and would directly help me continue creating new material. Thank you to everyone who has followed and supported Haunted Tales of Darkness over the years.